The bid had reached $3,000. Lucian's calves burned. He'd been standing on the platform for 40 minutes, motionless as a statue, while the afternoon heat thickened the air in the auction house. Sweat gathered at the small of his back, traced a slow line down his spine, but he didn't shift his weight. Movement invited interpretation. Restlessness could be read as fear, adjustment as discomfort, and discomfort suggested weakness. So he remained still, though his legs trembled with the effort. The auction house on Royal Street smelled of tobacco, perfume, and something older, the particular mustiness of money that had been passed through too many hands. Afternoon light slanted through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like ash. Lucian watched them fall and thought about Democritus, who'd theorized that everything was composed of invisible, indivisible atoms. Invisible and indivisible. Like the thoughts he kept locked behind his carefully neutral expression. 3,200. The voice came from the back. Lucian didn't turn to look. He'd already catalogued every person in this room during the first 15 minutes, when bidding had been merely enthusiastic. 27 potential buyers. 14 men. 13 women. He'd learned to read a room the way other men read newspapers, quickly, extracting the essential information, noting the dangerous elements. He knew what they saw. The angular bone structure inherited from a French grandfather he'd never met. Eyes the color of amber in sunlight, shifting to burnt gold in shadow. Skin like café au lait. Beautiful, they called it, as if beauty were a simple fact rather than a sentence handed down without appeal. His left foot had gone numb. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. 3,500. Madame Devereux. Her voice carried a tremor she probably didn't notice. Lucia had watched her arrive an hour earlier, widow's black silk rustling, face veiled. Now she sat forward in her chair, breathing hard enough that he could see her chest rise and fall even from 12 feet away. What did she see when she looked at him? Certainly not the man who'd read Schopenhauer's essays on love and found them too generous. Schopenhauer claimed love was biology's trick for ensuring reproduction. But what drove Madame Devereux had nothing to do with creation. This was about filling a void that her husband's death had torn open. Lucienne was meant to be the filling, beautiful, compliant, endlessly available to whatever role she needed him to play. The floorboards beneath his feet creaked as someone shifted weight in the front row. The sound seemed loud in the thick silence between bids. 3,800. Mr. Thornton. Now. The shipping merchant who collected rare things the way other men collected debts. Lucian had researched him through the invisible network of kitchen gossip that flowed through New Orleans like an underground river. Thornton had a wife he ignored and a mistress he bored. He wanted Lucian for the same reason he wanted his Peruvian parrot in its gilded cage, because other men would envy the acquisition. Lucian's throat was dry. He'd been given water 2 hours ago before being brought to the block. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. The psychology was simple. Thornton's sense of self depended entirely on external validation. Strip away the admiration of others and he would collapse inward like a building with no foundation. Pathetic, Lucian thought, then immediately felt ashamed. Who was he to judge? He'd survived by learning to become whatever mirror they needed. The only difference was that he knew he was performing. $4,000. The room erupted in whispers, a susurration like wind through dry leaves. Lucian felt something shift in his chest, a tightening that might have been fear. $4,000 could buy 3 skilled craftsmen, a small plantation, passage to Europe and back. For $4,000, they were purchasing a fantasy that didn't exist. Miss Caroline Rossiter had made this bid. 22 years old, judge's daughter, engaged to a banker's son in a match arranged before she'd left the schoolroom. Her face was flushed, a deep rose color that spread from her cheeks down her neck. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. Lucian understood her better than the others because he recognized the thing driving her. the desperate need to assert control over a life determined by others. She didn't want him. She wanted transgression, rebellion, a story she could tell herself about her own daring. She wanted to be the kind of person who did shocking things. He'd felt that way once, at 17. He'd believed that if he accumulated enough knowledge, someone would eventually see past his face to his mind. He'd imagined conversations about Kant's categorical imperative, debates about Rousseau's social contract. No one had ever wanted to discuss philosophy with him. The air in the room was stifling now. Lucien could smell sweat, his own and theirs, mixing with the perfume and tobacco. His shirt clung to his back. What they wanted was simpler and more complicated than conversation. They wanted him beautiful and silent. A blank canvas for their projected desires. The few times he'd tried to reveal his education, the results had been disastrous. One mistress had wept, claiming he'd destroyed her innocent enjoyment. Another had grown angry, insisting he was putting on airs. A third had found it titillating for exactly one evening before growing bored. So he'd learned silence. He'd learned to survive by disappearing into whatever role they needed. 4,200. Madame Devereux again, her voice cracking. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles white beneath the gloves. Lucien watched her construct her justification in real time. The slight tilt of her head, the way her lips moved soundlessly as if rehearsing explanations she'd give later. The human capacity for self-deception was bottomless. He'd spent 15 years studying it. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He wanted desperately to wipe it away, but his hands stayed loose at his sides. The slave owner who claimed Christian charity while treating humans as cattle. The wife who spoke of love while purchasing a person to fill the emptiness her marriage couldn't touch. The young woman who believed buying him was rebellion rather than simply another expression of her class's assumption that money could purchase meaning. Lucien had read Plato's cave allegory in a stolen philosophy primer. Prisoners chained in darkness, mistaking shadows for reality, violently rejecting anyone who showed them the sun. He'd thought he understood it intellectually. Standing on this auction block, his feet numb and his back aching, he understood it in his bones. 4,500. Mr. Thornton, his jaw set, face reddening. He was approaching his limit. Lucien could read it in the hesitation before his hand rose, the way his eyes darted to his accountant standing against the far wall. The widow had no such restraint. She would bid until she won or until someone physically stopped her. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about feeling something, anything, in a life that had become a series of empty social performances. Lucien's heart beat faster. He could feel it against his ribs, a prisoner testing the bars of its cage. He almost pitied her. But pity required distance, and there was none. He was the object of her obsession, and history was full of objects of obsession destroyed when they failed to live up to impossible fantasies. A memory surfaced. Charleston, 5 years ago, another auction house. A woman had bid an astronomical sum then, too. He'd spent 2 years in her household, standing decoratively in her parlor during social calls, displayed like the paintings on her walls. She'd never touched him, never spoke beyond basic instructions, but she'd looked at him constantly with an expression he'd eventually identified as grief. When she'd finally sold him, she'd wept. Not for him, for whatever he'd represented in her internal drama. The floorboards creaked again. Someone coughed. The auctioneer's voice droned on, professionally enthusiastic, but the words blurred together. 4,800. Miss Caroline. Her voice steady, but her hands shaking hard enough that Lucien could see the tremor from where he stood. Her fiancé sat 3 rows back, face a mask of humiliation and rage. That engagement was finished. Whether she won this bid or not, she'd already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Did she understand what she was destroying? Or was the destruction itself part of the appeal? Lucien thought about choice. True choice required genuine options. These bidders believed they were choosing freely, exercising will in an open market. But they were as constrained as he was. just by different chains. Chains of expectation, of psychological need, of unexamined desires driving them toward destruction. His chains were visible, legal, enforced by violence. Theirs were invisible, internal, enforced by shame and the desperate need to maintain their self-image. His mother's face flashed in his memory. The day before she was sold away, when he was 7, she'd knelt before him and gripped his small shoulders. Her eyes had held something he only now understood as terror mixed with grief. "Your face will bring you nothing but sorrow, child. Learn to make yourself small. Learn to hide what you are." He'd tried. God knew he'd tried. A fresh trickle of sweat ran down his spine. The room tilted slightly. Too long standing, too much heat, too little water. $5,000. The room went silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of shock. Even the auctioneer seemed stunned, though he recovered quickly, his voice ratcheting higher with professional enthusiasm. $5,000 was beyond obscene. It was a complete abandonment of rationality. Madame Devereux had made this bid standing now, veil pushed back, face naked with something that looked like anguish. She was past caring what anyone thought, past calculating social consequences, past everything except the compulsion that had seized her. Lucian's heart hammered. His mouth was so dry he wasn't sure he could speak even if he wanted to. His vision narrowed slightly at the edges. This is what I do to people. Not intentionally, not through any action, simply by existing in this particular body, with this particular face, in this particular place. He was a catalyst for madness, a trigger for obsession, a walking psychological crisis, and he'd never asked for any of it. The auctioneer was asking for higher bids, but the room had gone quiet. Mr. Thornton sat back, defeated. Miss Caroline had covered her face. The other bidders watched with expressions ranging from relief to envy to barely concealed schadenfreude. $5,000. Going once. Lucian's mind raced. Madame Devereux would win. He would become her property, more valuable than most people's annual income. He would go to her house, learn her rhythms, her moods, her needs, become what she required, survive by reflecting back what she needed to see, by hiding his thoughts so deep that sometimes even he forgot they existed. The plan was clear. The plan had always been clear. Disappear into usefulness. Make himself indispensable by being whatever they needed. Survive. $5,000. Going twice. Then something shifted in Lucian's chest. Small at first, barely noticeable. Like the first crack in a dam before the flood. His hands were shaking now. He couldn't stop them. He'd been standing here for 40 minutes watching these people bid for ownership of his body, his time, his life. Watching them project their griefs, their desperations onto a person who didn't exist. Watching them compete for the right to possess something they would never actually have. They wanted a fantasy, a mirror, a blank screen. And he'd been planning to give them exactly that. To survive by erasing himself so thoroughly that he could slip through their lives, causing minimum disruption. But standing here, his feet numb and his heart racing and $5,000 hanging in the air like a noose, Lucian made a different choice. His throat constricted. His pulse pounded in his ears. Every survival instinct he'd honed over 15 years screamed at him to stay silent. He would speak. The thought crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. He would speak, and he would tell them exactly what they were buying. He would name the thing they refused to name. He would force them to see him not as a fantasy, but as a thinking, feeling human being who understood them better than they understood themselves. It would be catastrophic. Speaking would shatter every rule of survival he'd learned. It would invite violence, punishment, possibly death. You did not speak from the auction block. You did not address your betters. You did not name the truths everyone had agreed to ignore. His breath came faster now, shallow. His hands trembled openly. But $5,000 had been bid for a person who didn't exist, for a fantasy that could never be fulfilled. And Lucian was suddenly violently tired of being the blank screen for other people's unacknowledged desires. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Lucian's mouth was dry as sand. His heart felt like it might burst through his ribs. Every muscle in his body tensed. The gavel began its descent, and Lucian drew breath to speak. The gavel froze mid-arc. Lucian's voice cut through the thick air of the auction house, clear and deliberate. Each word enunciated with the precision of someone who'd learned French from Parisian tutors and English from forbidden books. You bid $5,000. For what exactly? The room didn't gasp. It simply stopped, breathing, moving, thinking. 27 faces turned toward him with identical expressions of shock, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly begun reciting poetry. The auctioneer recovered first, his face flushing crimson. You will be silent. No. Lucien kept his eyes fixed on Madame Devereux. His heart slammed against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. 15 years of controlling his expression, his tone, his every visible reaction. All of it had been training for this moment. I will not be silent, not while she spends a fortune on something that doesn't exist. He shifted his weight, feeling pins and needles shoot through his numb feet. The small movement seemed enormous in the frozen stillness. Madame Devereux. He addressed her directly, watching her face pale. You see in me your husband's lost passion, don't you? You want to feel desired again, to prove you're still alive, still capable of inspiring devotion. But I cannot give you that. No person can restore what time has taken. The widow's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her gloved hands clutched at her throat. Lucian turned his attention to Mr. Thornton, who had half risen from his seat, face contorted with rage and confusion. Mr. Thornton, you want to possess what other men envy. You don't care about my thoughts, my preferences, whether I dream or despair. You want a trophy that makes other men jealous at your dinner parties. But envy is not intimacy, sir, and possession is not connection. This is outrageous, Thornton sputtered. Is it? Lucian's voice sharpened. The trembling in his hands had stopped. Something cold and clear had settled over him, like ice forming over water. Is it more outrageous than spending $5,000 on a human being? More outrageous than 27 people gathering to bid on a person as if he were a racehorse or a chandelier? Someone in the back stood up, chair scraping loudly against the floor. Lucian didn't look to see who. His eyes moved to Miss Caroline, who sat frozen, her face streaked with tears she didn't seem to notice. Miss Caroline. His voice softened slightly, though the words remained sharp. You think buying me is rebellion, a way to shock your parents, to feel dangerous, to prove you're more than the porcelain doll they've made you. But I am not your revolution. I am a person who reads Voltaire at night when no one's watching, who dreams of seeing Paris, though I never will, who grieves a mother sold away when I was 7 years old. Caroline made a sound, half sob, half gasp. You want to feel alive? Lucian continued. Then live. Make real choices. Marry whom you want or don't marry at all. Study what interests you, travel, write, create something. But don't purchase a human being and call it freedom. That's not rebellion. That's just another form of the same cruelty you claim to oppose. The auctioneer had backed away from the podium, uncertain how to proceed. Judge Rossiter stood in the third row, his face purple with rage. 2 men near the door were whispering urgently, probably debating whether to physically silence him. Lucian's throat ached with thirst, but he forced himself to continue. This moment wouldn't last long. Soon they'd restrain him, gag him, drag him away. But not yet, not quite yet. You are not bidding on a person, he said, raising his voice to address the entire room. You are bidding on your own fantasies, your own emptiness, your own unspoken desires. And the tragedy is, I can fulfill none of them. Because what you actually want, none of you will name, not even to yourselves. Madame Devereux had begun to weep, silent tears streaming down her face. I will tell you who I am, Lucian said, since none of you thought to ask. His voice was steady now, fed by something deeper than fear or anger. This was the voice he used in his own mind, in the privacy of his thoughts, when he allowed himself to be fully human. I speak 4 languages. I have read more philosophy than most of you. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hume, Rousseau, Schopenhauer. I read them in stolen moments, in hidden corners, risking punishment for the crime of literacy. I compose music in my head that I can never write down because paper and ink are denied to me. I have loved, though that person was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, and I will never see her again. I have opinions on politics, on art, on the nature of God and justice and human dignity, all of which I must hide because you cannot bear the thought that property might think. Someone near the back shouted something, but Lucian couldn't make out the words over the roaring in his ears. The woman who just bid $5,000. He looked again at Madame Devereux, who had collapsed back into her chair. She doesn't want these truths. She wants the illusion, the fantasy that never speaks back, never contradicts, never reveals itself as disappointingly, frustratingly human. His breath came faster now. The ice that had steadied him was beginning to crack. So here is my question to all of you. He spread his hands, a gesture that encompassed the entire room. What happens when the fantasy talks? When the mirror reflects back not your desires but its own soul? Can you bear it? The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A woman in the second row stood and hurried toward the exit, her face hidden behind her hands. Or will you punish me? Lucian continued, his voice dropping lower. For the crime of being human in a body you've decided cannot contain humanity. Judge Rossiter found his voice. Constable, restrain that man immediately. 2 men started toward the platform, but Lucian wasn't finished. The words poured out now, propelled by 15 years of enforced silence. You call me beautiful as if it were a compliment, as if beauty were a gift. But beauty has been my curse since childhood. I was sold at 14 because an overseer's wife became obsessed with me, not with who I was, but with what she imagined I represented. I was sold at 17 because a plantation owner's daughters competed for my attention, though I gave them none. I was sold at 20 because a mistress wept over me, mourning her own fading youth. The constables had reached the platform steps. Lucian spoke faster. Every place I've been, I've caused chaos without intending to. Women have destroyed their marriages over me. Men have grown violent. Families have fallen apart. And through it all, not one person has asked what I want, what I feel, what I think about any of this. Rough hands grabbed his arms. He didn't resist. Do you know what I think? His voice rose as they started to pull him from the platform. I think you are all prisoners. Prisoners of your own making, chained by rules you're too frightened to question. You look at me and see forbidden desire, transgression, everything your society tells you that you cannot have. But you don't see me. They were dragging him now, his feet scraping against the wooden floor. The room had erupted in noise, shouting, crying, the scrape of chairs as people stood or fled. You have never seen me, Lucian shouted over the chaos. You see only yourselves reflected back, and you hate me for it, not because I've done anything wrong, but because my existence reveals the emptiness of your own lives. Someone struck him. The blow landed on his left cheek, snapping his head to the side. He tasted blood, but through the pain, through the hands restraining him, through the angry voices calling for his punishment, Lucian felt something unexpected. Relief. For 3 minutes, he had not been property. He had been a voice, a person, a thinking, feeling soul who refused to be silent. They dragged him toward a back door, away from the main entrance where respectable people shouldn't have to witness such a scene. His feet found purchase briefly, and he managed to turn, to look back at the room one final time. Madame Devereux sat motionless, her face buried in her hands. Mr. Thornton had turned his back, shoulders rigid with fury or shame. Impossible to tell which. Miss Caroline was being led away by her father, her face blank with shock. And scattered throughout the room, among the outraged and the horrified, Lucian saw a handful of faces that wore different expressions: uncertainty, discomfort, something that might have been recognition. They'd heard him. Not all of them, perhaps not even most of them, but some had heard. The back door opened onto an alley that stank of rotting vegetables and horse manure. The constables threw him against a brick wall hard enough that his shoulders screamed with pain. "You stupid bastard," one of them hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Lucian laughed. The sound surprised him, raw and slightly unhinged. Blood from his split lip ran down his chin. "Yes," he said, "I know exactly what I've done." The constable's fist connected with his stomach. Lucian doubled over, gasping, but the laughter didn't entirely stop. It bubbled up between gasps for air, inappropriate and uncontrollable. He destroyed himself, shattered every careful strategy of survival, guaranteed that his next owner, if there was a next owner, if they didn't simply kill him for the disruption he'd caused, would be the worst possible placement. Hard labor in the fields, brutal overseers, perhaps sold to one of the brothels that specialized in unusual merchandise. The second constable grabbed his hair, yanking his head back. "What's so funny?" Lucian met the man's eyes. His own were wet, tears from the pain in his stomach, or from something else entirely. "For 15 years, he said, his voice hoarse, "I've been whatever people needed me to be. Silent, compliant, invisible despite being constantly watched. I've erased myself to survive." He drew a shuddering breath. "And just now, for 3 minutes, I was myself. Completely, utterly myself. Do you understand? I was real." The constable released him with a sound of disgust. Lucian slid down the wall, his legs no longer able to support his weight. "He's lost his mind," the first constable muttered. "Heat and stress. We've seen it before. What do we do with him? Hold him until the magistrate decides. This kind of disruption, property speaking out of turn, causing a public disturbance, possibly inciting other slaves to rebellion. There'll have to be a hearing." They hauled him to his feet again. Lucian didn't resist as they bound his wrists with rough rope that bit into his skin. His shoulder throbbed where it had hit the wall. His stomach ached. His lip continued to bleed, but his mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in years. He thought about Plato's cave again. The prisoner who escapes, who sees the sun, who returns to tell the others what he's discovered. The others don't thank him. They don't celebrate his revelation. They kill him for disturbing their comfortable darkness. Lucian had escaped for 3 minutes, had seen the sun, had spoken the truth that everyone agreed to ignore. Now came the punishment. They marched him down the alley, away from Royal Street, toward the city jail. Behind them, Lucian could hear the commotion still echoing from the auction house. Raised voices, the sound of someone weeping, the rumble of scandalized conversation that would spread through New Orleans like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone would know. The slave who spoke from the auction block, who addressed his betters by name, who dared to articulate the thoughts that property should never have, much less express. Some would call him mad. Others would call him dangerous. A few might whisper that he'd said things that needed saying, though they'd never admit it publicly. But they would all remember. The afternoon sun beat down on the narrow alley. Sweat stung Lucian's eyes. His feet, numb for so long on the auction platform, now screamed with sensation as the constables forced him to march. A cat darted across their path, disappearing into a gap between buildings. Lucian watched it go and thought about freedom. How different it looked from the outside than it felt from within. The cat was free to run, to hide, to choose its path. But was it truly free, or just operating within a different set of constraints? Hunger, territory, the constant threat of predators. Perhaps absolute freedom didn't exist. Perhaps there were only different forms of constraint, different cages with different bars. But choosing your own cage, choosing how to exist within it, choosing when to speak and when to stay silent, that was something. That was a kind of freedom, however limited. They turned onto a wider street. People stared as the constables marched him past. A woman pulled her daughter closer, as if the girl might be contaminated by proximity to such a spectacle. Two men in expensive suits paused their conversation to watch, their faces registering curiosity and contempt. Lucian kept his eyes forward. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing shame or fear on his face. The jail loomed ahead, a squat brick building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. They would lock him in a cell. He would wait there while officials decided his fate. And then would come whatever punishment they deemed appropriate for a slave who'd forgotten his place so thoroughly. But he would face it as himself, not as a fantasy, not as a mirror reflecting other people's desires. As Lucian, educated, observant, human. They reached the jail door. The constable knocked, and somewhere inside, locks began to turn. Lucian took a last deep breath of outside air. It smelled of the river, of flowers from someone's garden, of life continuing regardless of individual tragedy. The door swung open, and Lucian walked through it with his head high, his split lip still bleeding, his heart still pounding, but his soul, for the first time in 15 years, entirely his own. The cell was 8 feet by 6 feet. Lucian measured it in his first hour by counting footsteps, a habit learned in childhood when quantifying things made them less frightening. Stone walls, damp from the humidity that seeped through everything in New Orleans. A wooden bench, a bucket in the corner, one small window too high to reach, admitting a square of fading afternoon light. He sat on the bench and waited. His hands had stopped shaking. The adrenaline that had carried him through his speech had drained away, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. His shoulder throbbed where it had struck the wall. His stomach ached from the constable's punch. His split lip had finally stopped bleeding, leaving a taste of copper in his mouth. But his mind felt clear, dangerously clear, like air before a storm. Footsteps in the corridor outside. Lucian didn't look up. He'd learned to distinguish between footsteps that meant something and footsteps that were just guards making their rounds. These were purposeful, accompanied by the jingle of keys. The cell door opened. A woman stood in the doorway. Not Madame Devereux. Lucian registered that immediately with something like relief. This woman was older, perhaps 60, dressed in deep green silk that marked her as wealthy but not ostentatious. Her hair was silver, pulled back severely. Her face was lined but handsome, with intelligent eyes that studied him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Behind her stood the jailer, looking uncomfortable. She purchased 10 minutes. The jailer waited outside the open door while she stepped into the cell. She remained standing. Lucian didn't rise from the bench. He was too tired to perform anymore. Her name was Vivienne Laurent. She'd been at the auction, not bidding, just observing. She had interests in property law, she said. That wasn't quite true. She'd come because she'd heard rumors about him, about the disruption he'd caused in other households. Curiosity, she admitted. Lucian said nothing. Words had cost him everything today. He would not spend them carelessly. She studied him with the same intense focus he'd spent years directing at others. What he'd done was either the bravest thing she'd ever witnessed or the most foolish, she told him. Perhaps both. He asked if it mattered which. She tilted her head slightly. The consequences would be the same regardless of his intentions, she said. Did he know what would happen to him? He could imagine. She laid it out clinically. The magistrate would hear his case tomorrow morning. Charges of inciting disruption, speaking out of turn, possibly attempting to incite rebellion. They'd inflate everything to justify severity. Guilty verdict, inevitable. Then sentencing. Public whipping, certainly. They'd want to make an example. After that, private sale to the harshest placement they could arrange. Sugar plantation, most likely. She didn't need to mention the mortality rate. He already knew. 3 years on average before disease or exhaustion or accident claimed you. The sugar plantations were where slaves were worked to death because importing new ones was cheaper than preserving the ones you had. So he'd spoken his truth knowing it would kill him, she observed. That was either nobility or madness. Neither, Lucian said. He was just tired. Tired. Tired of being a mirror, he explained, of being everyone's fantasy, of hiding so deep inside himself that sometimes he couldn't remember who he actually was. He thought if he was going to die, and they were all dying, just at different speeds, he'd rather die as himself than as whatever convenient fiction they needed him to be. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the jailer coughed. What he'd said to Miss Caroline, she continued, about making real choices, studying, traveling, creating something. Had he meant that? Every word, even though those options weren't available to him? Lucian's laugh was dry, especially because they weren't available to him. He knew what freedom could look like. He'd read about it, imagined it, built entire worlds in his mind where people chose their own paths. The fact that he couldn't have it didn't make it less real, didn't make it less worth wanting. She mentioned he'd read Voltaire. Among others, he confirmed. What did he think of Candide? The question surprised him. Lucien studied her face, trying to understand what she wanted, but her expression revealed nothing, just patient curiosity. He thought Voltaire was right that blind optimism was foolish, he said slowly. That the world was full of cruelty and injustice that no amount of philosophical rationalization could justify. But the ending was wrong. She asked how so. We must cultivate our garden, Lucian quoted. Voltaire meant it as resignation. Focus on your small plot. Ignore the larger world's horrors. But he read it differently. Cultivation required choice, agency, the ability to decide what to plant, what to nurture, what to let die. That wasn't available to everyone. Some people didn't have gardens. Some people were the gardens, cultivated by others for their purposes. Vivian's expression shifted, something like recognition or perhaps respect. He was wasted, she said quietly. All that mind, all that education he'd fought for, all those thoughts, wasted in a system that couldn't see him as anything but property. Yes. Did that make him angry? Lucian considered the question. His honest answer surprised him. Not anymore. Anger required hope that things could be different. He'd spent years angry, believing that if he just proved himself intelligent enough, educated enough, useful enough, someone would see his humanity. But the system wasn't designed to see. It was designed to obscure, to simplify, to categorize in ways that made exploitation possible. He flexed his hands, feeling the rope burns on his wrists. Now he was just tired. And occasionally, like today, reckless. Reckless, she repeated. Was that what he called it? What would she call it? Testimony, she said. Witness. A refusal to let them pretend he wasn't human. She'd been attending auctions for 3 years, watching how people bid, what drove the prices, the psychology of ownership. She'd seen hundreds of people sold. Not one had ever spoken the way he did today. And look where it got him, he said. It got him here, yes. She agreed. Facing punishment, possibly death. But it also got him something else. She told him what had happened after they'd dragged him out. Madame Devereux had collapsed, had to be carried to her carriage. She was reportedly under a doctor's care now, sedated, incoherent. Mr. Thornton had left immediately, refusing to speak to anyone. Miss Caroline had broken her engagement, publicly in front of witnesses. Told her father she would rather die unmarried than become property in a different form. Something stirred in Lucian's chest. Not quite hope. He'd meant what he said about hope. But something adjacent to it. 3 other women who'd been bidding had withdrawn from society, Vivian continued, claiming illness, but rumors suggested they were confronting things about themselves they'd rather not confront. The auction house was in chaos. Half the city's elite were demanding his immediate punishment. The other half were very quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that suggested thinking they didn't want to do publicly. It wouldn't change anything, Lucian said. One speech didn't dismantle a system. No, she agreed. But it planted seeds, made cracks in foundations. forced people to see what they'd been trained not to see. She studied him. He'd said he could imagine what would happen to him: public whipping, then sale to a sugar plantation, death within 3 years, probably less. Had he accepted that? What choice did he have? There was always choice, she said. The question was whether he was willing to pay the price. She glanced at the door, checking the jailer's position. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. She had a proposal. Lucian's pulse quickened despite himself. She owned a small estate outside the city. Officially, she used it for crop experimentation, testing new agricultural methods, rotating plantings. The reality was more complicated. She employed people there, some enslaved legally, some who'd escaped bondage and needed protection while she arranged passage north. Understanding began to dawn. Lucian kept his face carefully neutral. She could purchase him. After the public whipping, that was unavoidable. They needed their spectacle. She could arrange a private sale, bring him to her estate. He would work there, legitimately at first. Then, when arrangements were made, he would disappear. An escape, officially. Happened sometimes on remote properties. By the time anyone investigated, he'd be in Ohio, or Pennsylvania, or Canada. The offer hung in the air between them. Lucian's mind raced through implications, possibilities, risks. Why would she do this? He asked. Because waste offended her, she said. Because the system he described so accurately was an abomination. Because she was wealthy enough to indulge her conscience and old enough not to care what society thought. She was quiet a moment. She'd had a sister once, brilliant woman, spoke 5 languages. Her husband had treated her as decorative furniture. She died at 35 with nothing in her eyes but emptiness. Waste, Vivian said, her jaw tightening. And because what he'd done today took more courage than she'd seen in 60 years of life. That deserved to be rewarded, not destroyed. If she was caught helping escaped slaves, Lucian began. She was careful, she interrupted. And she had resources. Money, connections, lawyers who asked very few questions. The risk was real but manageable. Lucian wanted to accept immediately. Every instinct screamed at him to grasp this lifeline, this impossible second chance. But years of surviving by questioning everything made him hesitate. What did she want from him? He asked. In exchange? Nothing, she said firmly. She wasn't offering this as a transaction. She was offering it because it was right. Though, she paused. If he did make it north, if he did find freedom, she would ask one thing, not as payment, but as a favor. What? Right, she said. Document. Tell his story, not just the dramatic moments like today, but the daily reality. What it was like to be intelligent, educated, fully human, and treated as property. The psychological toll, the strategies of survival, all of it. Because right now, the people who defended slavery told a story, that slaves were content, simple, incapable of higher thought. And the people who opposed slavery told a different story, that slaves were noble, suffering, waiting for rescue. Both stories were lies. The truth was more complicated. And that truth needed to be told by people who'd lived it. Lucian thought about this, about the books he'd read in stolen moments, about the internal world he'd built to survive, about the observations he'd accumulated over 15 years of watching people lie to themselves. If he made it north, he said slowly, he would write. He would try to tell the truth as clearly as he could, but he couldn't promise it would make a difference. Nothing made a difference immediately, she said. Change was glacial, incremental, maddening in its slowness. But glaciers did move. Mountains did eventually erode. Systems that seemed eternal did eventually fall. The question was, did he want to live long enough to contribute to that change, however small? Or did he want to die here, having spoken his truth once magnificently but briefly? Put like that, the answer was obvious. He wanted to live, Lucian said quietly. He wanted to survive. He wanted, his voice caught, He wanted to see what he might become if he was allowed to be fully himself. She nodded. Then they had an agreement. The whipping would happen tomorrow afternoon. They'd want an audience, want to make the lesson visible. She would be there. Afterward, she would approach the magistrate with an offer to purchase him. The price would be low. He was damaged goods now, troublesome, potentially dangerous. They'd be relieved to be rid of him. And if the magistrate refused to sell, he asked. He wouldn't, she said. She knew him. He was practical, fond of bribes disguised as consulting fees, eager to resolve this situation with minimal further disruption. Her expression hardened. But he needed to understand. The whipping would be real. They'd want to break him publicly to show that speech like his had consequences. He would need to endure it without giving them the satisfaction of breaking him. Could he do that? Lucian thought about the sugar plantations, about mortality rates and exhaustion and bodies worked until they simply stopped functioning, about dying as a mirror, never having been fully himself. Yes, he said. He could endure it. Good. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. After today, after what he'd said, some people saw him differently. Not as property or fantasy, but as a person who thought and felt and had legitimate grievances. That was dangerous. Not just to him, but to the entire system. They'd want to discredit him, to convince everyone he was insane or manipulative or somehow an exception that proved the rule. He knew. But there would also be people, not many, but some, who heard him and couldn't unhear it, who saw their own faces in the mirror he'd held up. Those people were the ones who might, eventually, change things, not because of one speech, but because of accumulated discomfort, small cracks becoming larger fissures. She knocked on the door. The jailer opened it immediately. "Thank you for your time," she said formally, her voice carrying the proper distance of someone who'd interviewed a prisoner out of idle curiosity. Most enlightening. She left without looking back. Lucian sat alone in his cell as the square of light from the high window faded from gold to orange to deep purple. He tested his body gingerly, the bruised ribs, the aching shoulder, the split lip. Tomorrow would bring worse pain, much worse. Public whipping wasn't designed to reform. It was designed to destroy, to strip away dignity along with skin. But after the whipping came possibility. A chance. Not certain. Nothing was certain. Vivian could be lying, could be insane, could be some elaborate test. The magistrate could refuse to sell. The escape could fail. 1,000 things could go wrong between tomorrow and freedom. But for the first time in 15 years, Lucian had something beyond mere survival to hope for. He leaned back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the auction house again. Madame Devereux's face when he'd named her grief, Mr. Thornton's rage, Miss Caroline's tears. He heard his own voice, clear and deliberate, speaking truths that had been locked inside him for so long that releasing them had felt like exhaling after holding his breath underwater. Had it been worth it? Even if Vivian's offer proved false, even if tomorrow's whipping was the beginning of the end rather than a passage to something better. Yes, it had been worth it. For 3 minutes, he had been fully himself, uncensored, unfiltered, refusing to perform the role that survival had demanded. 3 minutes of absolute authenticity in a life that had required constant disguise. Some people lived entire lives without 3 such minutes. The light faded completely. Darkness filled the cell. Somewhere in the building, someone was singing, a low, mournful melody that carried through the stone. Lucian didn't recognize the song, but the emotion was universal. Sorrow, endurance, the determination to survive another day. He added his voice to it, so quietly that no one could hear. The words were from a poem he'd memorized years ago, something by Shelley found in a book left open on a study desk. The world's great age begins anew. The golden years return. The earth doth like a snake renew her winter weeds outworn. renewal, transformation. The possibility that systems which seemed eternal might shed their skin and become something different. Lucian wasn't naive enough to believe he'd see such transformation in his lifetime. But if Vivian's offer was real, if he did make it north, if he did survive to write, then perhaps his words would be one more small pressure on a system already full of cracks. Glaciers did move. Mountains did erode. Nothing was truly permanent except change itself. He thought about his mother, sold away when he was 7. He'd spent years trying to remember her face, but the details had faded. What remained was the feeling of her hands on his shoulders, the urgency in her voice when she'd warned him about his beauty, about the necessity of hiding. If he made it north, he would try to find her. The chances were infinitesimal. She could be anywhere, could be dead, could have been sold a dozen times since. But he would try. And if he couldn't find her, he would write about her. About what it meant to be torn from your child, about the casual cruelty of a system that destroyed families without thought. He would write about all of it, the small degradations and the large, the psychological toll of being treated as property, the internal world he'd built to survive, the beauty that had been his curse, the silence that had been his strategy, and the 3 minutes when he'd finally, catastrophically, spoken. Tomorrow would bring pain, but after pain came possibility. Lucian settled himself as comfortably as possible on the wooden bench. Sleep would be difficult. His body ached, his mind raced, and the bench was hard. But he'd slept in worse conditions, and tomorrow he would need whatever strength he could gather. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet his thoughts. Slowly, gradually, exhaustion pulled him under. His last conscious thought was a question he'd asked himself 1,000 times before, but which now had a different resonance. Who would he be if he were allowed to become fully himself? Tomorrow, perhaps, he would begin to find out.